This is Fothentic History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Brian Young.
And I'm Holly Fry.
So today we're going to be talking about the invasion of Naboo, and this is actually going to be a two-part episode. We have the invasion portion of the episode in part one, and then the actual Battle of Naboo in part two. So Holly, I hope you're okay with that.
I think I can manage.
Well, as I got to researching this topic, there was just way more than I realized going on.
Right, it's one of those things where I think people don't always consider how pivotal this moment in galactic history is.
No, they don't at all. So with that, we'll just get started. So when we talk about the sparks that led to the fire of the Clone Wars, we tend to talk about the Separatists and that first flashpoint on Geonosis that kicked off the conflict. But a case could be made that the path to the Clone Wars actually began during a lesser-known and lesser-studied battle from about 10 years prior on the tranquil world of Naboo.
But before we get into the politics and the situation of the actual invasion of Naboo and how that gave us really the Clone Wars, we need to delve a little bit into some details about Naboo itself first.
So, Naboo was a world close to the border of the Outer Rim territories and was an incredibly peaceful, tranquil planet. It was occupied by two sentient species, the humans who lived on the surface, and an amphibious sea-dwelling species known as the Gungans. To paint a picture of the planet, imagine the humans living in cities full of classical architecture set amidst lakes and rolling hills on the surface, with few signs of the advanced technology they possessed. Cities like the capital of Theed were an artisan's dream.
And then, beneath the surface, there were Gungan cities. So these were really beautiful displays of hydrostatic technology, which is to say they basically lived in pockets of air that were contained by these technologically developed force fields. And the city itself really looks like this just lovely cluster of jewels beneath the sea and is grown organically into the subterranean rocks and outcroppings that naturally existed. And in fact, much of the rigid pieces in Gungan technology are actually grown elements rather than manufactured items. And their government was overseen by a portly Gungan named Rugor Nass, who went by the title of Boss, so he was Boss Nass, of the Gungan High Council.
While the human and the Gungan cities of Naboo shared beauty, that's about all they had in common. During a misunderstanding generations prior that we have very little information about, the Gungans and the Naboo ceased contact with one another. Though they were distrustful of each other, they coexisted on the planet in peace. And this rift becomes important later in the story, but first we need to understand how the humans of Naboo ran their government and how that fit into galactic politics.
So Naboo was an oddity in that its human population was ruled by a young monarch. It tended to be a female, a queen, although young men were also elected to that position, so they would have been kings. And it was governed also by a much older governor. So during the time of this conflict that we're talking about today, before and after it happened, the governor was a man named Bibble. And some reports attribute his profession prior to becoming a public servant as being a professor of philosophy at one of Naboo's foremost universities.
So for the monarchs, there was a philosophy on Naboo that young people and their unbridled idealism made for better, wiser leaders. And the young woman who was queen during the Naboo conflict, who was a key figure as the conflict played out, was named Padme de Berry, though she took the name Amidala for her reign. Before she was elected queen, she was schooled in a legislative youth program and dedicated her life to public service. She was preceded immediately by a young man named King Varuna.
And the queen made decisions with the help of a governing council that consists of a number of officials, so including that governor, Bibble, and the head of security forces. And during this time, the captain of the security forces was a man named Panaka. And the council would all gather in the throne room in Naboo's capital city of Theed to help the king or queen and offer advice and counsel for their decision-making. And Naboo had, up to this point, enjoyed a really long-lasting prosperity and peace, and that is why they had no standing army.
Captain Panaka, who we mentioned was on the governing council, was in charge of the all-volunteer organization that made up of the Naboo security forces. So this was about the closest thing they had to an army, but this was they were trained in hand-to-hand combat and marksmanship, but they really dealt with like palace security and smaller situations. There was also a Royal Starfighter Corps, but their ships were elegant and decorational, more like escorts than hardened fighters. And this is why they had little recourse but to appeal to the Senate when the Trade Federation blockaded their planet, but we'll get into that a little later.
The humans of Naboo were also represented in the Galactic Senate at this time. That was by a man named Sheev Palpatine. And as far as anyone knew, up to this point, they saw him as a good and honest man who had really done some excellent work in representing the small Outer Rim planet. Sheev came from an influential family, but they all died at one point, so he was pretty much the last of his line. He was elected to the Galactic Senate while Chancellor Kalpana was in charge, and he remained in the post through Chancellor Finis Valorum's term.
So it's interesting to note here, actually, in the way the politics of Naboo shake out, that the king or queen of Naboo is strictly limited to 2 4-year terms. Senators and governors are not held to such a limit. So C.O. Bibble served as governor for a long time, as well as Senator Palpatine. They both just kind of kept going for as long as they could.
So now that the scene is set and we've given you kind of this overview of Naboo's political situation, it's important to talk a bit about how the Galactic Senate worked as well and the taxation of trade routes to the outlying star systems such as Naboo.
So the Galactic Senate, which was centered on the capital city of Coruscant, represented all of the worlds in the Republic for almost 1,000 years. And during the time of the invasion of Naboo, it was overseen by a chancellor named Valorum, who we talked about earlier. But it's important to note that planets and systems weren't the only entities that received representation in the Senate chamber. Influential business interests, like the Trade Federation, had full voting membership in the body. And I think it's pretty easy to look back on that and say, that might have been a problem to have those sort of money interests. I don't know, like...
It seems so odd to me that they would so openly be like, oh yeah, you have a big business, you should of course have a seat in galactic government.
Yeah, that just sounds like nothing short of bad news.
It's inherently flawed, so it's interesting that would have been part of the setup at some point.
Well, money buys influence, and it's not a good thing, I don't think. But that's just my perspective.
You say that now. Wait till you have a ton of money, and then you'll be like, I think that's a great idea.
Fair enough.
So, like Naboo, the Senate had no standing army. It worked with the Jedi as their peacekeeping force. And Jedi were, of course, renowned throughout the galaxy for their ability to settle conflicts. And normally they would be left to their own devices, but they could be directed by the Senate to intercede in specific conflicts or issues. And at this time, there were approximately 10,000 Jedi all working across the galaxy. They were settling disputes, dealing with these conflicts that cropped up, though many of them lived on Coruscant in the Jedi Temple. They were basically just a speeder ride away from the Galactic Senate building.
And the Senate was a hotbed for parliamentary politics, and according to Senator Palpatine, a cesspool of corruption. And that's easy to see where you've got, the Trade Federation having membership. I think that's, we could see that. So, according to him, every small move the Senate wished to make was a bureaucratic quagmire because of the influence of money in their politics. And by many accounts, Valorum was a good man, but unable to shepherd the Senate through the delicate intricacies of these corrupt political webs.
And it was in this climate that the free trade zones that existed in the outlying parts of the galaxy were eliminated. The Trade Federation had used those zones across the galaxy to trade their goods cheaply without having to pay government entities for the trade that they were doing. So when they were eliminated, this meant that they would have to pay the governments of planets with which they were trading goods and services. And like any major piece of legislation that's passed, it had very serious ramifications for a number of entities. And in this case, of course, that was the Trade Federation and Naboo.
And this is where we get into the blockade, right? So the Trade Federation had no interest in cutting into their profits by paying taxes to the Republic or to any of the worlds in the formerly free trade zones. They were incensed, but most likely they would have done nothing about the situation had they not been approached by a Dark Lord of the Sith named Darth Sidious.
So, as a quick aside, I know we've talked about the Sith a little bit before, I think, on the podcast, but in case people do not know, at this point, it was believed that the Sith had been extinct for a millennium, and that their part in this plot was not apparent. That was only discovered way after the fact. So the Sith were, of course, powerful dark side users who passed on their teachings one at a time. So there was this rule that only two could exist at any given moment, and one would be the master and one would be the apprentice. And the ultimate goal of the Sith was to take revenge against the Jedi for their annihilation as a larger entity, and as a secondary goal, they aimed to accumulate personal power.
So with the backing of this Sith Lord, the Trade Federation was emboldened to intensify their protest over the loss of these free trade zones. So instead of arguing their situation in the Senate, they were encouraged to blockade Naboo. Now, this was a legal move wherein they would make sure no goods came in or out of Naboo until their demands were met, or the free trade zones in this case were put back in place. And although in the grand scheme of things to the Senate, this was no big deal because, who's Naboo? But to Naboo, this was nothing short of a planetary crisis.
Since the Naboo did no formal trade with the Gungans, and this was a planet that was largely agricultural and artistic in nature, they really needed the goods and services provided by the rest of the galaxy. So when the Trade Federation stopped that trade, Naboo was put in a really terrible position. The Senate, of course, debated this blockade, which they didn't exactly like, but there was enough political gridlock that they wouldn't do much about it, and they certainly were not doing anything in any sort of expedited manner.
In order to try to relieve some of this pressure, the Chancellor Valorum, opted to send ambassadors to try to settle the conflict. If the Naboo and the Trade Federation could come to an agreement between themselves, that might offer Naboo the relief they needed, and then it would bring the Trade Federation to heal in a way that would be much faster than would be possible in the Senate. And what the Chancellor didn't tell anyone was that he had asked two Jedi to act as those ambassadors.
The Jedi sent by Valorum were Master Qui-Gon Jinn and his Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi. And they traveled to Naboo aboard the Radiant 7, which was a consular-class space cruiser. It was also painted red, which signified its diplomatic mission, and that was on behalf of the Galactic Senate. And their mission from the Chancellor was to negotiate with Newt Gunray, who was the Viceroy of the Trade Federation, in order to settle the conflict.
Now, Valorum had assured Senator Palpatine from Naboo that the ambassadors were on their way to do exactly that, but he kept from him that the ambassadors were Jedi. And this move proved prescient for reasons that'll become clearer later. If Valorum had told Palpatine then, things might have turned out very differently, and as it was, things didn't go very well anyway, but at least this sort of gave it a chance.
When the Jedi arrived, they were ushered into a small waiting room where they were expecting to meet with Gunray and other representatives of the Trade Federation. But what they did not know is that Gunray, who was completely shocked to learn that Jedi had been sent to settle his dispute, reported immediately to Darth Sidious for further orders. So, to stop just a moment, we should also give you some context on who Newt Gunray was.
So Gunray was a Nemoidian. Like all stakeholders in the Trade Federation, and a proud, if somewhat cowardly male of the species. He'd risen to the rank of Viceroy of the Trade Federation and was the one approached by Darth Sidious about stepping up the aggression of the Trade Federation in the wake of the Republic's taxation. He was convinced that what the Dark Lord recommended was the correct course of action, so when he reported that two Jedi had come to settle that conflict, he didn't hesitate when he was ordered to kill them.
Sidious had been enraged at this point that the Chancellor had sent Jedi to settle that conflict. Not only because they were his sworn enemy as a Sith, but also because they had the power and leverage to really change his plans. They would easily be able to convince the Trade Federation to cease their blockade. Obviously, he ordered Gunray to kill the Jedi immediately and invade the planet. And Gunray, as we just mentioned, did not flinch when it came to this idea. He was ready to kill Jedi, but he did balk at the legality of the invasion. So Sidious promised in this exchange that he would, quote, make it legal, and it being the invasion in this case.
That's a really interesting sort of like hair to split. Like, okay, I'll totally kill these Jedi, but this invasion...
You're not going to mess with my business though, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, we can get rid of the evidence of that, but the planet's a little larger scale. I don't know if... Yeah. Can you make that look right? So, doing so ordered, Gunray destroyed the Radiant Seven with the captain and first mate aboard and tried to kill the Jedi by flooding the conference room that they were waiting in with dioxis, which is an extremely poisonous gas. And after the gas had presumably killed the Jedi, he sent in a squad of B-1 battle droids who would be immune to that gas to destroy what was left of their bodies. Like he wanted no trace of them left. And what he didn't realize, since he'd never encountered Jedi before, was that they were able to hold their breath long enough to escape and suffered no ill effects from the poison. So with the aid of their lightsabers, they were able to easily cut through the battle droids and make their way toward the bridge of the Trade Federation control ship. This was obviously unnerving to him.
So back on the planet's surface, Queen Amidala had assembled her governing council, and they were hoping that they would soon see a speedy end to this conflict. They were talking by holo with Senator Palpatine, who assured them that the ambassador sent had indeed arrived and that a swift end to this conflict was imminent. But the communications were cut in the middle of this discussion. C.O. Bibble immediately and insightfully insisted that this communications disruption was proof positive of an imminent invasion. Captain Panaka expressed fears that this would lead to a full-scale war, which was, of course, problematic because, as we mentioned earlier, Naboo had no army to field against such an attack.
So Queen Amidala assured her council that she would not allow the Naboo to get embroiled in a war, but unfortunately, that really wasn't her choice. In orbit around her planet, even though the Jedi were loose aboard his ship, Newt Gunray was at that very moment launching a full-scale invasion against the Naboo, exactly as C.O. Bibble had promised.
Now, we don't know exactly how many droids and landing ships the Trade Federation sent to the planet, but we do know that it was enough to control the entire surface and take the capital city of Theed with little resistance. The droids also did a lot of damage just in their landings. They had massive multi-troop transports, known as MTTs, and armored attack tanks, known as AATs, that devastated wildlife and foliage on their marches into the cities. I mean, they basically just rolled over ancient trees, they destroyed habitats of many native animals, all across the countryside of Naboo, just sort of as a secondary damage to the stuff that they were actually aiming to do.
So Gunray was unable to kill the Jedi, but he did rout them, and it was aboard one of these landing ships that they stowed away. Now, Gunray ordered his droid commanders on the surface to keep vigilant looking for the Jedi so they wouldn't be able to interfere with the pending occupation, which was, of course, exactly what the Jedi hoped to do.
Qui-Gon suggested they stow aboard separate ships. This seems like it was a move to ensure their mission to warn the Naboo of the pending invasion was not jeopardized. So in a standard situation, Qui-Gon was probably assuming that the Naboo would be mounting a defense to shoot landing ships out of the sky. Splitting his forces into two ships offered better odds that at least one of them would make it to the surface to aid the Naboo and help them through this unprovoked and somewhat unexpected attack.
Being a peaceful planet, the Naboo had no such defense against these landing parties. So Jin and his Padawan made it to the surface and reunited there with little resistance. But they found they were on the opposite side of the planet of Theed, which was not helpful. It was then that they found a local guide to help them.
So this guide would become incredibly pivotal to the war effort later. But at this point in the story, I mean, he was basically just a stateless outcast who no member of either indigenous society on Naboo wanted anything to do with. So this is he's become somewhat infamous, but really has gotten an unfair reputation, I think. He was a Gungan named Jar Jar Binks. And at this point, he had actually been banished from the underwater city of Oto Gunga for clumsiness.
For those who don't know, though Gungans can swim from the surface to the depths where their underwater cities are located without the aid of breathing devices, they do prefer traveling in bongos. Now, bongos are underwater submarines with organic shells grown in the sea, and they move Gungans around speedily. Now, a Hablibber is a luxury model of one such submarine, and Jar Jar's exile began because he crashed into Boss Nass's Hablibber.
Despite his banishment, Jar Jar Binks was quickly made to realize the dire nature of the situation playing out on Naboo's surface, and he was persuaded into taking the Jedi to see Boss Nass and the rest of the Gungan ruling council in Oto Gunga.
So the Jedi were granted an audience with Boss Nass and the rest of that council, and the Jedi tried to convince the Gungans to use their army, which was considerable, to enter into the conflict. Now, Kenobi argued that the Gungans and the Naboo lived in symbiosis. If the Naboo were destroyed or subjugated, it would certainly be felt by the Gungans. Jin explained that there would be consequences sooner than that, and that once the droids took control of the surface, they would be coming for the Gungans next.
Boss Nass was not swayed by their arguments. He insisted that the Gungans would, at best, remain neutral in the conflict. And not only was he a proud leader, unwilling to lose face in the ancient argument between the peoples, he viewed the invading army as strictly the problem of the Naboo. And he reasoned that the army on the surface was simply their own mess to clean up. The best he offered was the loan of a bongo so that the two Jedi could travel to Theed through the underwater core of the planet.
As for Binks, he was dangerously close to meeting a bad end for returning to Oto Gunga, the Gungan city, and despite his banishment. But Qui-Gon Jinn intervened, convincing Nass to allow Binks to continue serving as their guide.
Once the Jedi arrived in Theed, it was apparent that the Trade Federation had effectively mounted a full occupation. Amidala and the entire governing council had been captured, and it was at this point that Newt Gunray revealed that he would be putting the citizens of Naboo into camps for the time being, and that Queen Amidala would be signing a treaty that would legitimize the occupation.
So, historians speculate that this plan might not have been the actual plan of the Trade Federation, and that they must have been getting further orders from the Sith Lord. Rounding sentient species into camps and subjugating populations is very much a Sith plan. Nemoidian merchants, probably not as much.
And so with that thought, we're actually going to cliffhang you a little bit. We're going to leave you here until part 2. So we have all of this set up, and next we will get into the battle. So tune in next time and you will get all of that scoop.
That's it for another episode, and we all of our mail has almost exclusively just been thumbs up emoticons. So
we could just read that thumbs up emoticon.
Yeah. Thumbs up.
Happy
emoticon.
Ewok.
But for those of you who want to check out the podcast, we have a website now, so you can visit us at fauthentichistory.com. And you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Fauthentic or on Twitter at Fauthentics. And where can people find you, Holly?
I am at Surliest Girl on Twitter, and that's probably the easiest place.
And people can find me personally at Swankmotron. You can direct all mail about the show to me, Brian at BigShinyRobot.com, or if you go to FauthentichHistory.com, there is a contact form, and you can send us mail that way. So for another episode of Fauthentic History, thank you very much.
Thank you.